It started with something so small that I almost laughed when I first realized it was becoming a problem. The kind of issue most people would dismiss without a second thought. The kind of rule nobody expects to turn into a full-blown war. A harmless detail, barely noticeable, suddenly became the spark that ignited everything. At the time, I had no idea how far the HOA was willing to go, or how quickly a minor technicality would transform into threats, pressure, and a calculated attempt to assert control over my home. I had lived in the neighborhood long enough to understand its rhythms. It was one of those planned communities that looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes, neatly painted houses lined up like copies of the same blueprint. The kind of place where nothing stood out, and that was exactly how the HOA liked it. From the moment I moved in, I followed the rules closely, not because I feared them, but because I had no reason not to. The HOA had always been present in the background, sending the occasional newsletter or reminder, but never interfering directly with my daily life. That sense of quiet balance ended the day a notice appeared on my door. At first, I assumed it was another routine reminder, maybe about trash bins or lawn maintenance, but when I read it more carefully, I felt a strange mix of confusion and disbelief. The notice cited a violation over a minor exterior detail, something so insignificant that I had never considered it an issue. According to the HOA, this tiny detail violated a clause buried deep in the community guidelines, a clause no one ever talked about, enforced only when someone decided it should be. The tone of the notice wasn't friendly or informative. It wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was firm, cold, and carried the unmistakable implication that consequences were already being prepared. There was a deadline attached, a short one, and a warning that failure to comply would result in fines and further action. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't about the rule itself. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to my surroundings. I noticed similar details on other houses, the same small deviation from the rules, the same overlooked technicality. Yet none of those homes had notices taped to their doors. None of those homeowners were being threatened. That realization shifted my frustration into something heavier. This wasn't consistency. This was targeting. I reviewed the HOA handbook, page by page, line by line. The rule did exist, buried among dozens of vague and outdated regulations. It was written in broad language, open to interpretation. The kind of clause that could be ignored for years and suddenly weaponized when convenient. The more I read, the clearer it became. The enforcement depended entirely on who was being watched and who was being ignored. The following notice arrived faster than expected. This one escalated immediately. The language was sharper, more aggressive, referencing fines that would be applied daily if the issue wasn't corrected. It spoke of legal authority, of liens, of consequences designed to intimidate rather than inform. It was clear the HOA expected immediate compliance. Not discussion, not clarification, and certainly not resistance. What stood out most wasn't the threat itself, but the speed at which it arrived. There had been no attempt to communicate, no warning beyond the initial notice, no room for explanation. The HOA had skipped straight to pressure. It felt rehearsed, like a process they'd used before, a system designed to overwhelm homeowners into submission before they even considered pushing back. I documented everything, every notice, every detail that could matter later. I took photos of my property, photos of neighboring homes with identical features, and copies of the HOA handbook highlighting the inconsistencies. At that point, I still believed logic and documentation would be enough. I assumed once the HOA realized I wasn't an easy target, they'd quietly back off. Instead, they doubled down. The third notice made it clear that compliance was no longer optional in their eyes. The fines had already begun accumulating, despite the fact that the alleged violation posed no safety risk, no aesthetic disruption, and no measurable impact on the community. It was pure control, exercised through paperwork and authority rather than reason. That's when the emotional weight hit. This wasn't just about a rule anymore. It was about the sense of ownership over my own home. The idea that someone else believed they could dictate details of my property without justification. The stress crept in slowly. The constant awareness that every day brought another penalty, another mark against my name in the HOAS system. Neighbors began to notice the tension, though few said anything openly. In HOA communities, silence. It is a form of self-preservation. Everyone knows that involvement can turn the spotlight onto them next. Still, I could sense the unspoken awareness. The shared understanding that what was happening to me could happen to anyone. What the HOA didn't realize was that their threats had crossed a line. Now, I wasn't someone who reacted impulsively or emotionally. I approached problems methodically, and this one was no different. One researched HOA authority limits, state regulations, and enforcement procedures. I learned what they could legally do and, more importantly, what they couldn't. The deeper I looked, the more cracks appeared in their confident stance. The rule they were enforcing had never been updated to reflect current regulations. Their enforcement history was inconsistent at best. The fines they threatened exceeded what was permitted under local law without due process. Everything they presented as absolute authority was built on assumptions that no one would challenge them, and that assumption was their mistake. By the end of the week, the pressure had intensified. The HOA's communications became more frequent, more insistent, and less subtle. Each notice felt like an attempt to break me down, to force compliance through exhaustion rather than legitimacy. They expected me to cave quietly, correct the issue, pay the fines, and move on. Instead, I prepared. I organized my documentation into a clear timeline. I gathered evidence of selective enforcement. I reviewed legal precedents involving similar HOA disputes. The picture that emerged was undeniable. The HOA wasn't just overreaching, they were vulnerable, relying on intimidation rather than authority. Still, the real turning point hadn't arrived yet. The threat that followed wasn't just about fines anymore. It hinted at legal escalation, the possibility of liens against my property, a tactic designed to terrify homeowners into immediate submission. That was the moment I understood how far they were willing to go over something so small, so trivial, so absurd. And it was the moment they unknowingly triggered a response they never expected. As the fines continued to stack up and the HOA tightened its grip, I took my next step, one that would shift the balance completely and expose just how fragile their position really was. That was when everything began to change. By the time the HOA believed they had me cornered, their confidence had become their greatest weakness. They assumed the mounting fines, the formal language, and the looming threat of legal action would force a quick surrender. They believed silence meant fear. What they failed to recognize was that my silence was preparation. The pressure reached its peak quietly, without drama, the way bureaucratic force usually does. Another notice arrived, heavier in tone, outlining the total amounts allegedly owed and restating their intention to escalate if compliance didn't happen immediately. The wording suggested inevitability, as if the outcome had already been decided and resistance was pointless. It was meant to close the door on any remaining hope of pushback. Instead, it opened a new one. At that point, I had already assembled everything I needed. The selective enforcement was undeniable, supported by photographs, timestamps, and documented examples from within the same neighborhood. The AZON records revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and a complete lack of precedent. For sudden enforcement of this particular rule, even more damaging was their failure to follow proper procedure before issuing fines. A detail they clearly expected no one to question. I submitted a formal response. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive. It was precise, structured, and grounded entirely in facts. It laid out the timeline of events, referenced specific sections of the HOA handbook, cited local regulations governing enforcement, and highlighted their procedural failures. It requested clarification, documentation of consistent enforcement, and justification for the fines already imposed. What followed was silence. For days, there was nothing. No notices, no follow-ups, no threats. That silence spoke louder than any warning letter ever had. It signaled confusion behind the scenes, meetings that hadn't been planned for, conversations the HOA leadership hadn't expected to have. Their authority depended on momentum, and for the first time, that momentum had stalled. Then came the shift. The next communication was noticeably different. The language softened, stripped of its earlier certainty. References to immediate penalties disappeared, replaced with vague acknowledgments of my concerns. There was no admission of wrongdoing, of course, but the aggression was gone. The HOA was recalculating. Behind that shift was a simple truth they could no longer ignore. Escalation now carried risk. The documentation I had provided exposed them to scrutiny they weren't prepared for. Selective enforcement alone could undermine their position, but procedural violations made the situation far more dangerous for them. Any attempt to push forward could invite legal attention, something HOAs rely heavily on avoiding. Their power works best in the shadows, not under examination. Weeks passed, and the fines stopped increasing. That detail alone confirmed everything. If they truly believed in their authority, the penalties would have continued without hesitation. Instead, they froze them quietly, hoping to pause the situation without drawing attention to the change. It was a subtle retreat, but a retreat nonetheless. Neighbors began to notice. Word spread carefully. The way information always does, in HOA communities, people talked quietly, comparing notes, realizing that the same rule had been ignored for years until suddenly enforced against one homeowner who refused to comply. The unspoken fear that kept everyone compliant began to crack. If one person could push back and survive, others could too. The HOA tried one last maneuver. They proposed an internal review, framed as a goodwill gesture, suggesting a reassessment of the violation. It was positioned as cooperation, but the timing revealed the truth. This wasn't about fairness. It was about damage control. They wanted to resolve the issue before it attracted more attention, before it set a precedent they couldn't contain. The review concluded. Predictably, the violation was reclassified as non-urgent. The fines were quietly withdrawn. The enforcement language was revised to allow reasonable discretion. No apology was issued, no acknowledgement of error, just a carefully worded resolution designed to save face. On paper, it looked neutral. In reality, it was a complete reversal. What mattered most wasn't the outcome itself, but what it revealed. The HOA had never been acting from a position of strength. They relied on intimidation, ambiguity, and the assumption that homeowners wouldn't challenge them. The moment that assumption failed, their authority unraveled faster than they could control. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed. The HOA was still there, still sending newsletters, still enforcing rules, but the tone was different. Notices became less aggressive, enforcement more consistent. The leadership had learned an uncomfortable lesson. Control without accountability is fragile. As for me, the experience reshaped how I viewed ownership. A home isn't just a structure or a piece of land. It's autonomy, stability, and the expectation of fairness. When an organization threatens that over something trivial, it reveals its true priorities. Standing up wasn't easy, and it wasn't without stress, but it reinforced a simple truth. Authority only works when people believe it's absolute. The HOA believed I would fold instantly. They believed a small rule was enough to assert dominance. They believed fear would do the rest. They were wrong. What began as a minor technicality ended as a reminder that power depends on silence, and silence can be broken. The threat they issued over something insignificant exposed their vulnerabilities instead of mine, and the moment they realized it, the balance shifted permanently. In the end, the rule remained on the books, unchanged, but its power was gone. Everyone knew it could be questioned. Everyone knew enforcement wasn't inevitable. The HOA still existed, but the illusion of unquestionable authority had been shattered, and all of it started because they pushed too hard over something that never should have mattered in the first place.